Hey everyone, J.R. Foresteros here, and it is Thursday of Holy Week, sometimes called Maundy Thursday, which is derived from the Latin word for feet. So it's Feet Thursday, and of course, that references Jesus washing the disciples' feet. More about that in a moment. But this week during Holy Week, I've been taking some time to hang out with you and just reflect on some of what Jesus was up to during the week. And so we didn't do one yesterday because Wednesday of Holy Week is actually pretty chill. As far as we can tell, Jesus and his disciples just kind of hung out in Bethany. And we know Jesus was preparing for the events of today and tomorrow. But today we're going to talk a little bit about what the disciples must have been experiencing as they were preparing for uh, this next couple of days. Um, so in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which we call the synoptic gospels because they all are more or less telling the same story. That's because Matthew and Luke probably used Mark as their primary source for composing their gospels. So the word synoptic means same eye, like synonym, and optometrician, optometrist, eye doctor, right? And so same eye, right? They're seeing things the same way. And in these three gospels, the Last Supper is the Passover meal. It's the Seder dinner that Jesus shares with the 12 disciples. And so Jesus is crucified the day after Passover. In John's gospel, Jesus is crucified on Passover, uh, because in John's gospel, thematically, Jesus is the Passover lamb, the lamb that was killed to keep the angel of death from visiting Israel during the Exodus story. And so there actually is no Last Supper in John's gospel. Instead, what we have is the foot washing, which happens during a meal, but it's not identified as the Passover Seder, and there's actually no uh, take the bread and the cup communion thing that in a very strange way happens earlier in John chapter 6, where Jesus has this big lecture while he's in the wilderness about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. So anyway, all of that to say, in John's gospel, it's not a Passover Seder because Jesus is the Passover lamb who gets crucified on Passover. So in John's gospel, the whole thing that we're talking about tonight happens the day before Passover. In the synoptics, it is the Passover meal, it's the Last Supper, it's the Seder. Um, Either way, there's a couple of interesting things I wanted to observe. First is remember that the disciples were part of that crowd of pilgrims that entered with Jesus on Palm Sunday, and so they have by now come to celebrate Jesus as the Messiah and believe that he is the one that God has sent to deliver them from the forces of evil, including especially Rome. And so they have we know because of the way they act in the Gospels that they have pretty pretty heady messianic expectations. There's that story where James and John get into an argument about who gets to sit on Jesus's right and who gets to sit on Jesus's left, and the other disciples get mad. But they're not mad. They're not like, how dare these two ask that? They're mad that they didn't think to ask Jesus first. And so they're afraid that James and John got the jump on them. And of course, the Gospels all present this profound irony that those who are on Jesus's right and left on Good Friday tomorrow are actually two other insurrectionists who are being crucified alongside Jesus. Uh, so you take all of that into Holy Week, and I think you see what ends up happening to all of the disciples, but for some reason we kind of put it squarely on Judas's shoulders, is that they realize that for some reason Jesus is not as hype about his messianic mission as they are. Again, we got the temple cleansing that we saw on Monday. We get the showdown with the Jerusalem elite, the religious leaders that we saw on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, he doesn't do anything. He just kind of hangs out with his friends in Bethany. If you were at Catalyst with us a couple of Sundays ago, we talked about Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who live in Bethany, and that's probably where Jesus was hanging out, again, with the 12. So put yourselves in the disciples' shoes, right? They think they're marching into Jerusalem with the general of God's army, this guy who is now leading this ragtag rebel force that's rising up, who's soon in their imagination going to be met by the armies of heaven coming to fight at their side. And then this guy's going to be king once he's done with that. And again, instead of attacking Rome, he really only seems interested in attacking his own people. And instead of building coalitions and gathering forces and consolidating power, he seems intent to undercut himself at every turn. And then again, on Wednesday, he just does nothing, right? He hides. It's easy to think maybe this guy isn't who he thought he was. Maybe this guy lost his nerve. And in fact, that's actually what I argue in my book, Empathy for the Devil. One of my big villains that I explore is Judas, the guy who betrays Jesus, the guy who, again, I think we put a lot of responsibility on his shoulders for Jesus being crucified. And I argue that, we have, I think, vilified Judas in church history as though this was his plan all along, that he was rotten from the beginning, and that this was the jaws of a trap springing shut. But I just don't think that makes sense out of Judas then turning around and completing suicide after Jesus's death. I think the only thing that makes sense of that is if Judas didn't think Jesus was going to die. If in fact, and this is what I suggest in the book, what Judas thought was that Jesus really was the Messiah, but the kind of Messiah that everyone was expecting, this general, this commander of the armies of heaven, this one who had been prophesied and fated and chosen by God to rise up to be the new David and the new Moses and even the new Adam. And so when he sees Jesus losing nerve, I suggest that what we see happening in Judas is that he decides he believes in Jesus even if Jesus doesn't believe in himself. And so his act of betrayal is, in his mind, him seizing the gears of history and turning them himself, deciding that if Jesus is not going to rise up, he will force his hand. And he will put him in a situation where he has no choice but to be the person that Judas knows deep down that he is. Of course, what Judas doesn't understand is that Jesus has not come to conquer, right? Jesus has come to loot. Jesus has come to die. Jesus has come to expose the machinery of the empire for what it is and to release not just his own people, but all of humanity from tyranny and to liberate us all. And so, fast forwarding a little bit to tomorrow, but Judas kind of hangs on until the very moment Jesus dies. And he doesn't die by suicide when Jesus is arrested, obviously. He doesn't do it when Jesus is sent to Pilate. He doesn't even do it when Pilate condemns him to the cross or when Jesus is marched to Calvary. He literally hangs on, and you can just imagine him watching and waiting and saying, any moment now, this must be it. And when they call from the cross, if you're truly the Son of God, call down the armies of heaven and free yourself. Judas must be thinking yeah, please do that. Please do that. And of course, Jesus doesn't do that because that's not what Jesus is here to do. And so it's not until Jesus gives up his life that Judas realizes he's made a terrible mistake, that he has become the betrayer, that rather than seizing the gears of history and turning them for himself, he has caused the death of someone that he loved and followed. And so I think, again, we put all that on Judas, but we forget that Peter could have stood as a witness for Jesus at the sham trial. Would that have made a difference? Unlikely that it would have. If they are not giving any sort of due process to a well-respected rabbi, they're certainly not going to for an ex-fisherman from the Galilee, up north in hillbilly country. But Peter could have spoken up. He could have served as a witness. And instead of standing up and affirming Jesus's identity, he stands up and denies that he even knows Jesus 3 times. The rest of the disciples don't even make it that far, right? They abandon Jesus and flee into the darkness. And so, again, I think while we put all of that on Judas's shoulders, I think it's worth spreading that out among the rest of the 12 and saying, wow, these guys who all followed Jesus, all this time, and who even on multiple occasions made declarations like, we've given up everything for you. They don't make it to the end with him. They all flee and abandon him, even after he washes their feet, even after he shares this Seder meal with them, where he invites them to eat his flesh and drink his blood, even after he's repeatedly told them this is how this is going to go down. They can't see past their own agendas to see what Jesus is really up to. Again, even when Jesus literally puts on the dress of a slave and does slave work, which is washing their feet. A lot of our modern translations will read the word servant there, but they didn't have servants in Jesus' day. They had slaves, people who were subhuman, who were non-human in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of a lot of culture. And yet this is how Jesus dresses himself during this triumphant Holy Week, when he's in their eyes supposed to be this liberating general. During that time is when he does this, right? And so we see here in this space the disciples not able to see or hear who Jesus is because of their own expectations and agenda. And again, I think that's really worth reflecting on during this Holy Week. What expectations do we have about Jesus? What is our agenda for our life of faith? And are we willing to see Jesus for who he is, which is the Passover lamb, not the conquering lion, which is the one who washes feet as a slave, not the one who commands, the one who, in his own words, did not come to be served, but came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Can we see that this is who Jesus really is? Or do we insist on a Jesus who is triumphalist, a Jesus who conquers, a Jesus who leads with violence, who liberates with violence? Can we really follow this Jesus all the way to the cross, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about tomorrow when we get to Good Friday. So I hope that these are some questions you can take with you today on Feet Thursday, which I think even saying it like that kind of like gives me a little bit of the willies. But, Maundy Thursday sounds so much more nice and sacred and holy, but Feet Thursday reminds us who Jesus is. He's the God who washes our feet. I hope you can be with us tomorrow evening, Friday evening, 7 p.m. as we celebrate Good Friday together. And then I really hope you can join us 10:30 in the morning Central Time on Easter as we celebrate the resurrection. Really, really looking forward to it. So have a blessed Feet Thursday. Grace and peace go with all of you. And I hope you can join me tomorrow morning when we talk about Good Friday, and especially, tomorrow night and Sunday on our worship.